Okay, yeah. So today we're going to be talking about resources, and I think I often get asked about that resource question in TED, and I think it's one that crops up for a lot of teams. So our hope with today's session is that it's going to help you to encourage your team leaders to think about that resource question, but also feel comfortable talking openly about resources, because I think sometimes it can be a barrier for team leaders, and sometimes it can be a barrier to doing TED at all. We're going to cover a little bit of how you can support teams working with reduced resources, and we know that's the case for I think pretty much every team working in the NHS, regardless of what situation your organisation is in. I think right across the board, we're looking to streamline resources, to maximise the resources that we have, perhaps think differently about how we work. So the objectives today are to identify the challenges associated with limited resources, and look at some practical strategies for maximising resources and how TED can help more specifically. We're going to be looking at how teams can build team resilience and morale when it feels like things are stretched and when resources are taking the toll on the way the team works. So when we think about that question, it's number 20 in the Core TED survey. And the statement asks if we have enough resources to do our job. The results I've clipped for this slide aren't uncommon, I think. I clipped this from what a team I was supporting recently, but I think I often see something like this where the responses can be quite mixed. You might get different people in the same team who are responding quite differently to that question about resources. And I think, like a few questions in TED, it can be open to different interpretations, because resources, when you think about that, it might mean different things to different people. But on the whole, I think the average is commonly lower than some of the other questions that are in TED. And I think quite often I see the comments in TED surveys reflecting this as well. So there's lots of comments around resource related things, whether that be staffing or other types of resources that are in there. And I can see Justine, you mentioned in the chat, yeah, it is your lowest scoring question. I think that's the case for a lot of organisations, if not all of our organisations on TED. And I think if we just bring the next slide up. So on here, I've put the data from the last 3 years worth of TED. So I think, let me just check into my notes. So there's over 2,000 TED surveys in that sample of data, and this is across all of our organisations that are engaging with TED. And I think when we look at the high level data, those top performing questions in TED seem to be around things like team purpose, leadership scores quite highly, but also working together as well. And when I look at these specific questions that are on there, I think it highlights how many teams working in the NHS have quite a strong bond with each other and with their team leader. And I think quite often team purpose is a strength for a lot of teams. It's not to say that it isn't an area that teams should work on, but I think more often than not, it is a strength for a lot of teams. And I guess when we think about it, that sort of, to me anyway, that sort of makes sense in the NHS. I think when NHS teams work together, it's easy to understand what we're here to do. We work in the NHS because we want to make a positive impact on people's lives, whether that be through patient care or whether we're in a support function that helps people to deliver that patient care. But ultimately, people come into the NHS for similar reasons. So the idea that that team purpose is a strength, I think, is quite understandable. When we look at the lower scoring questions on the other side of this data, the themes relate to things like team engagement. There's a recognition question in there around review and celebrate success. But the lower scoring question across those over 2,000 surveys in the last few years is that one relating to resources. So it's highlighted there. The average is actually 3.15. So I think when you think about these, and I think some of you said in the chat, you know, it's not to be unexpected. I think, you know, I think for me, I would expect lots of teams to feel that this is a challenge. But actually, when I look at that data, and it's across a quite a large sample size, for me, 3.15 it isn't actually as low as I would think it would be. Which is quite encouraging. I think from a TED perspective, I like to think that teams that are using TED perhaps feel more positive around the resources that they have. And I definitely feel that that's the case with teams who I've seen have used TED multiple times. So maybe that's influencing this to some extent. But what it does show this is that resources is definitely a big factor for a lot of teams, and it's definitely something that's on people's minds. And I think when we look at those other themes in the lowest performing areas, things like recognition, team feeling full of energy, being enthusiastic about the team's work, I think for many teams, that resource question might be one of the underlying factors that does make teams feel low on energy, or feel a bit burned out maybe, or feel that they are particularly challenged. So it can affect engagement quite significantly. I don't know, I just wanted to throw a question out there. Does looking at this data, either the positives or the more negative, lower scoring sides, is there anything in there that surprises you? Or any sort of initial thoughts or comments on that data? Or is this generally what you see in your organisations as well? Yeah, Helen, you said similar to your results. Hazel, similar to what you see as well. And I guess this, you know, this is an average, so your data in your organisations is contributing to these figures. I think Sean said it's similar to what you see as well. So I think it is quite a consistent picture, you know, from our sort of central TED position. We see the data from different organisations, but on the whole, these are the types of themes that we see, that things like team purpose and leadership do generally score quite strong. And I suppose you could argue that teams that are doing TED are teams with strong team leaders who've sort of taken that leap to get involved in it. You could also argue maybe that team purpose is often one of the first topics that a team tackles when they do something like TED. So, you know, that might lead to those strengths. But yeah, I think, again, the lower performing questions, again, they don't seem that surprising to me, even though I'm obviously dealing with TED data a lot. So I do see this. But I think my general reflection is that this pretty much sums up how a lot of teams feel that I work with. Okay, so another question I wanted to throw out at this point: what resources do you think people are generally referring to when they're asked that question? So remember, the question is, we have enough resources to do our job. So what factors do you think can be influencing the lower scores or the higher scores in there? Yeah, quite a lot of you jumping in the chat there saying staff, people, staffing levels. Hazel, you mentioned equipment and budget. Yeah, I think you're right. Sean, you mentioned time as well. Yeah, really good ones. I think all of these things are absolutely right, and I suppose they're not separate things. A lot of the time, I think, you know, staffing might be the one that springs to a lot of people's minds, but that's intrinsically linked to budget, because we don't have the budget to take on any more allocation in our teams, or you know, we might be being told that there's a vacancy freeze in an organisation. It's something that we've gone through at Lancashire Teaching Hospitals, which affects teams because it affects that feeling that we can get more hands on deck to help out, or, you know, the ability to do that. And I think the challenge a lot of the time is that all of those things that you're mentioning are often outside a team's control. Yeah, Sean's mentioned it's good to see we're not on our own, and I think it's important to recognise that it's not specific to any one organisation, and it's definitely an NHS wide thing. We also have a university client that uses TED, and I think they still see similar things. So even in other sectors, they see resources as a challenge. And I think some that I've got on my slide there, I think you've mentioned most of these. So yeah, staffing definitely I think is the top one that a lot of teams think about. And I suppose that's partly because TED is about thinking about the team and the people that you've got in the team. But yeah, when we think about finances, that can impact on the equipment, being able to replace equipment or get new equipment. Because staffing is stretched, often that means we're short of time because we may be a smaller team trying to do the same level of work that the team was doing several years ago, or in a lot of cases maybe a higher level of work than they were a few years ago. And I think, and I'm not sure if anyone would mention it in the chat, I've put space on there as well. So I think in some organizations there might not be the space to do things how you would do in a perfect world. You know, if you could build your own hospital, or if you could decide where you worked and how you worked, quite often a lot of NHS buildings were maybe built years and years ago and weren't designed for the way healthcare works in today's environment. So again, intrinsically linked to finances, which impacts on all those other things. But I think the challenge with this, when a team talks about it through TED, is that it's really hard to change any of these things. A lot of these things are externally influenced, and definitely that one around finances, which is perhaps the biggest impact on all the others, that's not something as an individual team, in most teams anyway, that you can directly influence. Mm-hmm. So next question on from that is, what's the impact of that when teams do feel that they haven't got enough resource? How does that impact on the people in the team? Any thoughts on that, either from the conversations you've had or maybe in TED comments that you've seen? How can this take its toll on the team, I guess, is what I'm asking. Yeah, so lots of things coming through in the chat. I can see a few of you typing away. Hazel, you've mentioned feeling disheartened, burnout, possibly. Alison, you mentioned low morale, low motivation. Yeah. Helen, morale again and burnout. Lots of people saying morale. Justine, you mentioned impacts on engagement and communication. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important one to recognise, and I think that's something we've seen at Lancs Teaching. So, you know, over the last year, we've had significant financial constraints, and that has impacted things like our staff survey results and TED survey results in some cases as well. Megan, you mentioned feeling demotivated as well. So yeah, I think it does sort of. It definitely takes its toll on teams, that resource question. And when I come back, if I just go back to that earlier slide, when we think about some of those other lower scoring questions about feeling full of energy, about feeling enthusiastic, and maybe about recognizing success and those more positive things, that often can be brought about by a feeling that we don't have the resources to celebrate success in the way that we want to, or we don't have the time to make team decisions maybe in the way that we would like to in an ideal world. So I think quite often this resource question can underpin a lot of those factors. So I'll bring up the ones that I've got on here. Again, similar things that you've all mentioned. Stress, feelings of burnout. I think for NHS teams, and I talk about this a lot when I do accreditation training and other things like that, I think the feeling of burnout is often born out of being asked to push and push over recent years as we've gone through the pandemic, but then still being asked to push really hard, often with reduced resources. So a lot of NHS teams got extra resources during the pandemic to deal with those specific challenges, but we're now in a difficult position that we're being asked to dial back those resources while still dealing with backlogs, with you know, other competing pressures externally. I've got reduced engagement on there, as Justine mentioned. Reduced job satisfaction can be an impact of that. And then in terms of sort of more tangible impacts that can have, it can increase leaver rates, and whether that's just leaving the team or leaving the organisation altogether, it might mean leaving the NHS altogether, because there is that quite sort of challenging work environment in the NHS at the moment. So I think it highlights just how significant this this factor can be. Sean, you put in the chat, how do we promote the NHS promise when this is happening? Do you just want to come in and just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, part of our my job within leadership and organisational development is to promote the NHS promise to staff. This is what this is what the NHS say we as staff are entitled to working. We've all got a voice that counts. We are all, treated fairly, etc. And we just get it thrown back at, staff. Well, where's the evidence that we've got this? Yeah, we've got a staff survey. Where's the evidence that you actually do stuff on the back of the staff survey? Where's the, staff feel, as you says, a lot of this is outside our control.
Yeah.
So it does make it really difficult to actually, I'm one of these people that I've got to believe in something myself to sell it. And some days I don't believe in it. Our values are we care.
Yeah.
Do we really?
That's it. And you're absolutely right to highlight that contradiction, I guess, when we're being told to sort of dial back our resources, dial back our finances, or we can't afford to give care in the way that we would like to in an ideal world. It does feel contradictory to those people promise elements of, we value people, we care about our staff, we want to promote health and well-being, we want to ensure everybody is engaged in their work, enjoys coming to work. And it's really hard to put out those sorts of messages against a backdrop of trying to reduce things, whether it's headcount or funds available to do different things. And it is contradictory. And I think you've highlighted really well that it does highlight the challenge that team leaders have. So having identified the causes and the impact that resource challenges can have for teams, I wanted to focus next on what that then means for team leaders. And I think it's just what you've explained there, Sean, that's the sort of contradiction that team leaders are dealing with. And it's important to remember as well that team leaders are staff members themselves who are probably also wrestling with this. You gave your own example. You're trying to put out into the organization that we value our staff and that we buy into the people promise and we absolutely want the best for our staff. To keep the faith in that yourself sometimes when you hear things that do contradict it or undermine those sort of values in some ways. So I think in my experience speaking with team leaders, it can often be the case that team leaders might feel, sometimes they might feel guilty, sometimes they might feel a bit helpless because they're unable to control the factors that are impacting on the team. Often it is the team leader who has to say to the team that, no, we can't afford that new piece of equipment, or we can't replace that person who's left because of budgetary constraints. And it's really challenging for team leaders who are in that dilemma of trying to value the team, trying to value the staff, but at the same time having to take difficult decisions or at least feedback difficult decisions that might not even have been made by themselves. So I think the way you described it, Sean, was really good, that it's important that when you're trying to get across these things, when you're trying to sell it, I guess, you've got to believe in it yourself, and you've got to understand the reasons around it. And I think that does highlight how important good communication is with these, because it's a very sort of fine line of getting that balance right. And it's really difficult to communicate it to different people who might have different views, different opinions, different perspectives on the situation the NHS is in. So I think sometimes these feelings can be a reason that team leaders don't engage with TED in the first place. I definitely know in the past I've spoken to team leaders trying to encourage them to doing something like TED. And that resource question is one of the biggest fears for a lot of team leaders, because there's a real feeling that if they open that can of worms around resources and sort of openly welcome feedback on that, then it risks exposing something that they've got no control to influence, or they've got no autonomy over. And this represents an area of significant stress, really, for team leaders. And I put this quote on from the World Health Organization's definition of stress, and I think it applies really well to when you do feel there's a conflict between those two competing pressures, because team leaders will want to do what's best for the team. They want to give the team what they want or what they feel they need, but often it's external pressures that the team leader can't control that means that they can't give that to their team. So from a team's perspective, that conflict with external challenges, it can often mean that it's very easy sometimes to adopt a bit of a victim mentality and feel that, oh, all this is happening to us and we've got no choice, and it's, you know, everything that isn't working is not our fault because it's all this other stuff that's happening to us. So it's very easy to slip into that sort of mindset. And I think that's the real danger with, first of all, if you don't address the resource question, but secondly, if you don't approach it in the right way, and it does just become a sort of an avenue for sort of focusing on, you know, things that are happening to us. So the second part of this, what the World Health Organization have put on there, is that I guess it says that stress is actually quite normal. It's, you know, it's something which will happen, particularly in work environments where there are competing ideas, competing pressures. And I think it highlights that second sentence there, how it's important how we deal with it, that can influence overall well-being, and can influence how successfully we manage that stress that we experience. So what we've tried to do with TED around that resource question is help teams and team leaders to really think around how we acknowledge those challenges, but move that frame of reference, I guess. If I come on to the next slide, one of my own favorite toolkits, I talk about this heck of a lot, is that circle of influence activity. So it's Stephen Covey's sort of frames of reference model, I guess. And the approach accepts the importance of acknowledging factors that are affecting us. It is important. It's not about burying our head in the sand. And in fact, I think if we don't address things and just pretend that they're not there, there's a risk that they can become more of a pressure or have more negative impacts on a team. But the circles of influence process, if I can just start my animation, there we go, sort of walks us through, and the TED Toolkit walks us through how we can acknowledge those things that are external, but ultimately we need to let those things go and focus on the things that are more central to our sphere of influence or inside our direct control. And what we ask team leaders to do, and what I encourage team leaders to do, is start off in that external sort of space, because that's often where the resource question begins, but then think around how you can move that conversation towards the things that are inside our control as a team. And for from a team's perspective, we're perhaps thinking more around the second stage of that. So on this slide, we're thinking around what's influencing that that resource question being a bit lower, maybe. And then we think around, okay, what's the impact of that? The question becomes, how do we break that link? So we can't influence, for most teams anyway, we can't influence the space or finances, staffing that we have. But can we influence this other side? And I guess this is sometimes contradictory to what we say in other sort of fields. So generally, and I think clinicians will try to get to the root cause of a problem. But I think when the root cause is something which is outside your sphere of control, it then leaves you with thinking around, okay, how do we change the way that that impacts on us, that influences our team? And we're thinking around, how do we break that link from one side to the other? And what many of the toolkits in TED are designed to do is help teams think around, how can we control or influence the stress and burnout that our teams feel? Or how can we engage our colleagues to improve their satisfaction levels? How can we affect an individual's desire to want to leave our team or our organization? And when we sort of reframe that question, there's much more chance that there's something that sits within our sphere of control as a team. Whereas if we were just focusing on the external resources and asking ourselves, oh, how can we get more staff, or how can we get more finances? The answer often there is, we can't, it's outside our control. That creates that blocker. So it's important to try and move to the other side and think, actually, how can we counteract the impact that it has, or make sure that the impacts aren't as big as they could be, and that those negative consequences of people leaving the team or people's health and well-being being affected, how can we make sure we minimize the potential for that impact to happen? And this is where a lot of TED toolkits encourage leaders to think about. Okay, so one way that we can do this, I think, is outlined really well in this book. So last month, I think I shared insights from the Atomic Habits book by James Clear. This month, I'd like to reference one called Let Them Theory. So you might have heard of it before. I think she has been on some podcasts recently, sort of promoting this book. But the idea behind this, it's primarily a personal development book. And it is... it can be applied still to team situations, I guess is what I'm getting at. So for a team that's fixated on a lack of resources, this idea of a let them theory, and the idea is it's about acknowledging but being able to disconnect yourself from an external factor so that it frees up your energy and capacity to be able to take action. And for team leaders, I think the approach can help team leaders take positive action against changes or challenges that they feel are outside their control. So what I've got here is I've pulled out a few sort of concepts from the book that would apply to a team leader's role. And essentially, this is the circle of influence. So it's thinking around, you know, what's external and how can we sort of internalize that and make it feel like something that's inside our control. So the first one here is around, from a team leader's perspective, you need to acknowledge before taking action. So with your team, it's about giving the team space to express their concerns, but also taking care that you don't feed into any negativity that there might be. And that once you've given that space, you then try to guide the conversation towards practical things or steps forward that will help to energize the teams. So I'll share some coaching questions on these next few slides, but something that a team leader could ask is something like, I hear you're frustrated about the budget, and that makes sense. We understand it's a challenge, but what do you think we can do with what we have? And I think something like this is an example of how a team leader can be open around a challenging situation and still nudge the team towards some constructive steps forward. It helps the team, helps to show the team that the team leader understands, but also keeps the conversation positive. Next one I've got on here, it's about letting the team take ownership. So if the team keep focusing on limitations, a team leader can role model their mindset, but also challenge the team to propose solutions. So another coaching question a team leader could ask in this situation: given our constraints, what is the best way forward? So again, you're not dismissing the challenges, you're showing the team that you understand, but you're nudging them towards positive next steps. Next one we've got here, let them see that resourcefulness beats resources. And I guess one thing that team leaders could do is think around how they role model the positive behaviours that they want to see from the team. And in this case, it might be an opportunity for team leaders to show team members where there are opportunities to do things differently, to try something differently. And sometimes when resources are stretched, it does drive innovation. It might be, from a team leader's perspective, it might be adapting the leadership style, or introducing a new way of doing some things, or sharing some responsibilities across the team if that capacity is stretched. And you might use that as maybe a developmental opportunity for the team, or that opportunity for everybody to feel involved with what's happening. The coaching question here is, what's the one thing we can do differently to get the most impact out of what we have? And again, really useful when you're dealing with that resource challenge. And then final one on here, it's important to recognise that, as I said on the last slide, scarcity can drive innovation. So I think back to how teams did work through the COVID pandemic, when teams were challenged with uncertainty and challenged with lots of change happening, and there was a feeling that we weren't equipped to deal with what the pandemic was throwing at us. But actually what I saw, and what I saw through a lot of TED data as well, that actually that sort of common purpose brought a lot of teams together, and it helped teams think differently, think about new ways of working, about when we know we can't work in the way we perhaps have done in the past, we've got to adapt and we've got to change. So I think sometimes for some teams, using that opportunity to reflect back on previous challenges, or asking coaching questions like this, like, since we don't have X, how can we leverage Y instead? So it might be something because since we don't have any more budget, how can we leverage the team resource that we do have? Or thinking about what are our strengths, and TED can help tell a team that. We can help to think about what are our strengths that we can build on, and the question can then become, how can we leverage our strengths in TED so that we can overcome some of the challenges like resources that we might see. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, there is just one more on here. So I added this one a little bit later after I was pulling the slide together from the book. And it's something I see from team leaders quite often, that sometimes a team leader might be reluctant to get involved in TED because there's perhaps one really strong voice in the team, or maybe one or two people who might bring the results down, and that makes them a bit trepidatious around asking for that feedback. And I think the let them approach to this can be a useful mindset to have, because from a team leader's perspective, you can't force people to shift their mindset, and you can't tell people to feel a particular way, or to or even to act a particular way. The best way to get people on board is to bring them along with you. And I think the let them approach, sometimes it's important to let people stay stuck and to try and to keep your momentum. And that's what I encourage leaders to do sometimes with TED. And whilst you want every team member to come along with you on the journey that you're setting off on as a team, don't let one or two team members hold the whole team back. And if you can set the direction with the majority of the team on board and the evidence that you get from a TED survey, then the detractors will eventually have to recognize that things are moving on, and you'll have tangible evidence to show that things are moving on that will hopefully get those people on board each and every time you repeat that TED cycle. So another way of looking at it as well. Okay, so just to sort of wrap up on this topic, I wanted to signpost some reframing toolkits that we have in TED. And I think there's lots more than this. I've just pulled out 3 which seem particularly relevant, and I've seen teams use in the past when they are dealing with that resource style question. So the first one on there is that circle of influence. So if you've not seen it on TED, this is my go-to one a lot of the time. I think it can be applied to a lot of different team situations, but in particular, if there is a topic that a team is stuck on, the circle of influence reframing activity, call it what you will, helps teams to move past, and it helps to move the conversation past things that you might be stuck on, especially if they're outside your sphere of control. The second one in here, what pushes your buttons team exercise. So this one is a little bit of an individual survey, which you then pool together and talk about as a team. But when you do that, I think this exercise is a really good one to help team members have that self-awareness of how pressures might be affecting each other. So when we talk about resources, you mentioned in the chat, that leads to things like feeling burnout, feeling stressed, feeling low on energy. So if a team can raise awareness of what are those perhaps trigger points that are making us feel extra stressed or making our energy feel low, how can we watch out for each other? So it's about moving those things into the self-awareness sphere. And final one there is the energy and resilience exercise. And this is along the same lines. It's a bit of an individual reflective activity that then can feed into a team conversation around, okay, where do we feel really low on energy? What are the situations when we do feel low? And what are the situations which really do energize us? And how can we influence those or make sure we have more of those times when we do feel energized? I think definitely from my own experience, and I'm sure Lindsay would agree with me, in our team we have what we call a monthly retro activity where we reflect on successes that we might have had or things that we've learned throughout the month. And definitely for me, that is something that energizes me, because when you do perhaps feel stuck on a project or find it hard to move things forward, being able to look back and remember, actually, we've achieved this and this and this, we've moved along quite a long way, or listening to colleagues say what they've done and understand how it's all fitting together, that can really help to energize teams. So just some ideas in there and things you might want to suggest to teams. But as I say, the TED resources aren't limited to these 3, so do explore for other ones that can help in that sort of situation. Okay. So just to summarize, but I will sort of throw it open if you've any questions about this, but summary from today's session really is, when you're talking about that resource and when you're encouraging your team leaders to tackle that question, remember it's important to acknowledge the challenges before then trying to reframe the conversation and think around what's that link between the resource, which might be the cause, which is often outside our control, and the effect, and how can we break that link between the cause and the effect, or how can we minimize it as much as possible in our team. Okay, and that's everything from there, but are there any questions on that topic before I move on to next steps? Okay, hopefully that's been useful. I think it is one which we get asked on quite a lot, and as I say, the data in TED shows that is a challenge for a lot of teams. So hopefully this content will help. And something we're going to be working on over coming months is more resources for teams and team leaders to use around that resource question. So more toolkit resources, and we will be creating a version of this session for team leaders in our organisation at LTH. So when we've done that, we'll share the slides and the recordings and things that you can use to help team leaders through that challenge. Okay, so last up, please do give us your feedback. I think it's really useful because it helps inform sessions like this. Lindsay's kindly popped a link in the chat, or you can scan the QR code that's up on there. This was definitely one of the ones that people have requested over recent months. So keep letting us know how you're finding these sessions, and if there are any other specific topics that are maybe coming up with teams that you're working with, or that would help you as a practitioner to support others in your work with TED. And finally, just to signpost you to our upcoming events. So we're already at our first quarterly deep dive of the year. So I think that's around about 3 weeks away, Monday, 17th of March. So not long to go before that now. In the deep dive, we are going to be discussing TED team leader training, because we're introducing a new model at Lancs Teaching, so we'll be sharing that with you. But what I'd like to say is please come along and share your approach, and if you have any resources that you use in team leader training that maybe you've developed in-house, please do share them with us, because it'd be a great opportunity to showcase how different people are approaching that. We've got coffee catch-ups coming up in March and April, and our next Lunch and Learn session is on the 22nd of April. So fab. Thank you all for coming, and have a lovely weekend, and I look forward to seeing you soon at one of our future events. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lee. Very helpful again. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
Thanks.